Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and I echo all the thanks that Dina just listed for Greta and Kevorkian, NYU Abu Dhabi, and so on, and encourage also everyone to join AMCA. My name is Nada Shabut, and I am the founding director of AMCA, and I'm really happy to see how it had developed further. Okay, I was given the task of introducing the panels. And so our first panel is Writing the History of Art Outside of Art History. And we are lucky to have Kirsten Chide, an associate professor at the American University of Beirut, to be the discussant for this panel. I also just found out, although I remembered but somehow forgot, that Kirsten has exhibited as an artist at the New Museum, but also some of her research has influenced exhibitions like at the Tate Modern. So thank you very much, and I will leave it to Kirsten now to introduce the rest of the panel.
Okay, thank you. All right. Can I have the program, actually? So this panel is titled Writing Art History Outside Art History, Writing the History of Art Outside Art History. And our first speaker is Annabelle Boissier, speaking on behalf of a joint paper by Annabelle and Fanny Gillet. Annabelle is a graduate of the EHESS in Paris, where she did her doctorate on a comparative anthropology of Tunisian and Thai art. Right? Yeah. She has taught at the University of Tunis. She's published on globalizing processes in the art world and political cultural opposition in Tunis. She has also conducted, I would say, exhaustive bibliographic work documenting art writing from the region, from the North African region and Maghreb region. So, as for Fanny Gillet, she's a PhD candidate in anthropology at the EHESS. Annabelle, would you please start with your historicity processes and art histories in Tunisia and Algeria?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the AMCAP. I said, like the beginning of the association, I'm very pleased now to have the chance to participate to it. Because Fanny Gillet didn't get the funding to come, so I will mostly present the Tunisian part. She's the one who's working and had been doing her fieldwork about Algeria, so I'm switching a little bit. Sorry for my English. I hope it will be understanding for... sorry. Yeah. So, is it better like this? So if I'm too long, just cut me because I don't really know. I'm not so used to make the presentation in English. With Fanny Gillet, we start to collaborate in a comparative study between Algeria and Tunisia 1 year ago. So it's like of the starting of our collaboration, this presentation. Our purpose is to describe the ways art world actors have been constructing art history since the independencies of those two countries. Our aim is to produce a methodology and a theory able to analyze the modern and contemporary artist production in those two countries. In fact, at the beginning of our fieldwork research, we had been confronted to the same difficulties in Algeria and Tunisia, and before that, for me, in Thailand as well, even if it's not in the same geographical and cultural area. We had restricted access to the resources. We just have been speaking about this just earlier with you, the difficulty of we all face to find resources, the lack of theoretical studies about Maghreb visual art as well. And while as anthropologists we were mostly interested about present days, we had been confronting the need of history. We faced the glorious history of art movement, that the actors have been making since the independencies. And it's actually the same problem that we can find in other fields like political histories, like the French historian Pierre Vermeren had been analyzing, that this glorious history that we can find. So this presentation is actually about the construction of this glorious history that we would like to discuss. We will analyze the writing process of art history in the long term and see that it had not been linear. We had been selecting some writing publishing in mainly catalogs and booklet from the two countries, and try to find how those catalogs and writing in those catalogs are showing are presenting the art history of those two countries. I've been for the PowerPoint. I don't know how it's.
You just need to open your document.
I don't remember which one is it. It's this one. And is it working with this one?
I'm not sure actually. I think you need to stand up.
Okay. So sorry. This one is open. Is it okay? Yeah. Just to show you the different catalogs and resources I've been using for the Tunisian part, it's mainly some. This one, you have all the information on it, but this one is from the beginning of the century, and all the analysis of the writings will be take from those catalogs. This one have been held in Cairo in the late 60s. This one from Paris and Villeneuve-d'Ascq in the north of France. All the exhibitions are about contemporary Tunisian artists. This one is quite the same exhibition as the previous one. It's just to show you how the catalog have been evolving. So this is in the 90s, and in the 90s we can see that right now we have some true catalogs. It's not just booklets. The 19th as well. This one was in Paris in the Institut du Monde Arabe, and the two other ones have been held in the 2000 in Tunisia, and the last one have been held after the revolution in France and in Berlin. So just to show you that's it for the PowerPoint, so I will just go there. Just to show you what sort of resources we did use. And we can see that there is no exhibition from the 17th that I've been held about Tunisian contemporary art in foreign countries. And there is just one from the late 60s that have been curated by an artist. The other one have been curated by Tunisian or foreign intermediary. And maybe you have seen also that a lot of those exhibitions, the majority of them, have been held in Paris. So you can see as well the link between those two countries. So the aim of those historical narration is mainly to show the continuity between the colonial time and the independence time. They try to show that the Tunisian art already got a long history. For example, the artist El Meki, who have been curating the exhibition in Cairo, explained that the Tunisian art first took place at the beginning of the century, but it's already a very long history if we observe that in a very short number of decades, Tunisian had been going through the growth circle needed to get to the more current point of evolution in painting, like we see in other countries in the world. This point of the origin of this history is sometimes dated from the 1919, while an artist, Abdoulaye Wade, was working with the École de Paris in Paris. And sometimes the beginning is dated of the 1881, so the beginning started at that time with the Protectorate in Tunisia. It's the date of the Protectorate. Some other historians and writers in those catalogs try to start this history with the 30s and the participation of the Muslim artists to the life of the group of French artists which was based in Tunisia at this time. For example, I make a citation of Ali Loueti, which is one of the most important historians in Tunisia. The movement of Tunisian contemporary art born 1 century ago with the influence of colonial culture, all today an history already extended. All the time in all the writings from the 60s to the 80s, there is this aim to make the link, to say that it's short but very long in terms of type of experience which the artists have been working on. This is attention to the historical time contrast is really making a gap between the colonial writings. We can see a great difference between the first catalogue I've been showing you in 1880. No, sorry, 1990. And in this little catalogue, there is just few pages of writing. We can read the author referring to the history, not referring to the history, but referring to the geography of the country. So I'm quoting him: the oasis, the trees, the weather, the lukewarm shadow between the sweltering sky and the fresh ground, the edge of the desert and the foothill of the Atlas. What of a pattern for a painter? So we are just the opposite type of writing. It's in this same writing. It's also the lack of art history, which gives. In the eye of this author, the greatness of the 2 Tunisian painters. He's speaking about the virginal sensibility of the 2 young Arabs, which are not singing the Latin, and the young indigenous did not start to realize academic, non-legible paintings. It's the reason why they had been able to make the link between the art and the nature. So nature is, in this case, the geography. So the 2 types of discourses is quite opposite. So during the colonial time, the lack of history was seen as particularly positive because it's stressed because of this lack of history, the artist can access to the nature and to the Tunisian light. This fascination for the geography in the writing is still present in the writing of the White Father, Michel Lelong, in 1958. He has been doing an art history about painting, and he's starting with this interest to the geography, but very, very quickly he switched and argued that the local people are less sensitive to this geography. Nevertheless, he is thinking that the light, the sea, and the sun of Tunisia has an impact on its great art craft and contemporary art. And as you can see in the previous, this one, this exhibition is in exhibition on the 19th, and the title is still about the light of Tunisia. Alongside the theme of geography in this catalog, the first catalog, what is pointing out is that the starting point of the modern art. This starting point, I just speak about it, but maybe I will speak a little bit longer by another time. None of the art historian will refer to those two young Arabs as part of Tunisian art. The two young Arabs of the first catalogue are completely disappearing from the art history. The starting point is, as I said, Abdoulaye Wade, who have been working in Paris, and this starting is not so obvious as well. The starting point is very something we have to discuss. If Hatem El-Mekki have been referring to Abdoulaye Wade as the first Tunisian artist, for Ali Loueti, it's not so obvious when he's writing during the 80s. He's including Abdoulaye Wade, but he's tried to include some other artists, like those who have been working in the Bellical court. But all the time referring to the fact that we don't have a lot of documents about those artists. So it's kind of difficult to include them in the art history because finally we don't have resources to try to understand how they have been working, where they have been studying, what type of travel they have been doing. I'm very long. Okay. So I will try to... And this is in the 18, in the 90, the same Ali Loueti will start to include in his history the French and Italian artists who have been working in Tunisia as well. But this is only in the 19. And for this exhibition is the first time that the writer Nariman Ben Ramdan had been making the affiliation with the colonial institution, Institut Carthage, which was the cultural institution of French state. So she's making this link between the colonial and the Tunisian art history, while decades before, Hatem El-Mekki would make the difference between colonial and Tunisian art by not referring to the geography. But there is one thing that those authors are according to say, that is the true modern art Tunisian painters aren't the first one of the 30s, but they are the one after the generation after the independences. They are the one who had been sleeping with splitting with the colonization. In this purpose, the thinking of the universality, the aim to exceed to the folklorist painting, are for those authors the real beginning of Tunisian visual arts. And little by little, one decade after, this history will be fixed. So while Hatem El-Mekki during the 60s is presenting a lot of overlap of time stamping, the following writing fixed the limit of one age to another. So we will have the Tunisian art show begin at 1884, the pioneer in 1930, and the split generation in 1960. So I think I don't. Yeah. So I will switch just for the after 2000 and after the revolution. The author don't speak about history at all. So like if this history have been made, we know about it, and now it's not it's useless to write again these histories. So I will try to conclude. So much thing I didn't say. So the production of histories, the identification of the great men of Tunisian painting, and after that the unification was of this history during the 90s was supposing to construct the opposition to the colonization. And the slip between the time of colonization and the independence, as it was claimed by the generation of the 60s, leading to the autonomy of Tunisian art. And finally, the contemporary art during the 2000 don't need any more of this of making this separation between colonization and independence. So maybe I will stop here. I'm sorry, I mixed up a little bit. I hope it will be it had been understandable for you. Hope. Thank you.
Okay, I will now invite Ceren Ospinar to speak. Ceren is currently a visiting research fellow at the School of Fine Arts, the University of Leeds in the UK. She is also an instructor at the Istanbul Technical University, where she's completing her PhD in the history of art. Her paper is directly related to her doctoral topic in the historiography of Turkish art. And the paper is The New Art History of Turkey, an analysis of Turkish contemporary art historiography.
Thank you, Kirsten. Good morning, everyone. As Kirsten said, my topic is about contemporary Turkish art historical writing. And I'm going to... Can you hear me?
No.
Is it better?
Yes.
And I'm going to present you some preliminary findings that I came up with. But on the way to that, I will be giving you some basic information about the modern Turkish art historical writing. Of course, before getting to all of that, I should say that this is a work in progress, and this goes without saying that I really like to hear your suggestions and ideas about it. I'll be discussing from a critical point of view some issues, some of which arise in the academic field of art history, such as the canon, the narrative, the gender, and some others draw out from the daily or political life of Turkey, such as the East-West dichotomy and contemporaneity. I'll start with a quote from Hobsbawm, who in a speech given at Central European University in Budapest in 1993, asserts that, quote, "The history of backward countries in the 19th and 20th centuries is the history of trying to catch up with the more advanced world by imitating it," end quote. Hobsbawm then comments how 19th century Japan took Europe as a model and how Western Europe looked towards America. And finally, the Central and Eastern Europe, which was the subject of his speech, tried different models in politics and economy, but finally ended up imitating Western Europe and the States, as almost every other country in the world. Hobsbawm makes no reference to the Middle East, yet he makes me think about Turkey, a country where, long time ago, the state decided to take a general set of values called the West as a model, a country that occupies a liminal position between the East and the West, and at the same time stuck between them, and where this division is evident in the daily political, social, and cultural struggles. The story starts with the Ottoman Empire, which gradually integrated to the global modernity in the 19th century. Then the foundation of the Turkish Republic in 1923 came up with many reforms in order to progress the integration furthermore and adopt a Western style of governance, mode of living, education, and system of production. However, creating a republic, better yet, a nation state, was not that easy. Wallerstein stresses that, quote, "The nation states have played a double role to create national cultures, advocating for cultural diversity worldwide and enforcing a cultural uniformity within the nation, made them the most powerful and the most schizophrenic cultural force in the modern world," end quote. So the need for a Turkish national history of art arises under such circumstances in the early Republican period from 1923 onwards, when recently founded Turkish Republic commits itself to become a modern nation state. Apart from the studies that were structuring an origin story for the Turkish nation, art historical studies takes the things in hand in order to reveal the cultural history of Turks through time and space. Therefore, the histories built up in this period essentially are seen as attempts of incorporating Turkish art as a subfield in universal art history. A closer look reveals the nature of early Republican historiography of Turkish art, in which two main correlated tendencies come up. Each of them make an effort in its own way to bring Turkish and Western arts closer. Either they try to break up with Islamic artistic traditions while stressing non-religious aspects of Turkish art, or underline the rationality and developing character of Turkish art, linking it with the effects of geography and political context, largely under the influence of European scholars. The claim of being disregarded by European art history due to its imminent Orientalist bias emerges as a core problematic in both of them. Which is why, although these narratives carry on a nationalistic view, to a certain extent, they challenge these biases. For instance, Celal Esat Arseven, in his book called Turkish Art, published in 1928, locates Turkish art within the larger historical continuum of Central Asian Turkic art, stressing its rational and pure aspects, as well as integrating Ottoman art into the Turkish national narrative. Arseven argues at the same time for the distinct national character of Turkish art, which, in his opinion, makes an equal match with the European art. So he structures Turkish art historical narrative similar to European histories in order to make it possible to be included among them. İsmail Hakkı Baltacıoğlu, on the right-hand side, on the other hand, in his book Democracy and Art, published in 1931, emphasizes less on the larger historical frame and rather locates the Ottoman art within the tradition of ancient Greek art and Western humanist thinking, while making connections between the Ottoman art and the modern European ones, such as between comparing Ottoman calligraphy and Surrealist painting. Meanwhile, the conception of modern Turkish art develops upon some dichotomies, such as traditional, modern, or national, universal in context of Turkish identity. Since the art in Turkey has a long tradition in crafts or so-called traditional arts, following new routes such as modern art creates issues in terms of production and perception. New art journals carrying voices of art critics show many different views on the way in which artists should generate or improve modern Turkish art. Some of the writers suggest that the Impressionist Turkish art, called the 1918 generation, doesn't fit the modern republic, for it was emerged in the Ottoman era and reminds the Ottoman spirit and its ways of westernization. Some others, for instance Baltacıoğlu, assert that the art of democracy should be cubism, for it meets the artistic criteria for social modernization and rationality. They, or Baltacıoğlu, furthermore suggests re-evaluation of Turkish traditions with a modernist conception, which is the idea that brings one of the dichotomies immanent in both Turkish art and art historiography, traditional, modern. Later, some critics start to affirm the unique character of Turkish modern art, even though it takes European artistic movements as a model. Hence, national Turkish art conceived in the modern period, seen as a process of research and benefiting from the sources of Turkish art, as well as local traditional arts, making use of Western principles but not imitating them, and in the end, creating a self-evolving art that it adopts the ideals of the Republic. A closer look at the modern art historical texts reveals that many historians and writers were influenced by the Hegelian idea of progressive evolution, and then popular theories of Vienna School of Art History, which is why the formalism becomes one of the primary approaches in Turkish art historiography. And later historians decide to conceive the modern Turkish art in similar dichotomies as well. However, the emergence of many artist groups during the early Republican period changed the way in which their narratives conceived. For instance, Nurullah Berk, in his book Painting in Turkey, published in 1943, addresses art in groups and unions for the first time in Turkish art history, which becomes later a classification taken by other historians as a model for long coming years. A series of exhibitions organized in Istanbul at the Academy of Fine Arts in the 70s, such as the New Trends exhibitions, changed the perception of the way in which the works of art should look in the new era. Artists such as Füsun Onur, Füsun Onur, on the left-hand side, who educated in an art school in the States, or like Sarkis, right-hand side, who earlier decided to move to Paris, gradually came back to Istanbul during this time in the 70s. They either joined these exhibitions at the Academy of Fine Arts or opened solo shows while bringing a hint for the new art, new ways of art making to the local art scene. Under the influence of movements such as conceptual art or minimalism, the kind of works they created apparently marks an important milestone in the conception of Turkish contemporary art and art history. The proliferation of such exhibitions in Istanbul, the transformation of the economic and political structure by following the free market economy or neoliberal policies in the 80s, increase of the number of private art galleries due to the expansion of private capital throughout the country, the first Istanbul Biennial in 1987, and many more, all seem to account as the reasons behind the emergence of contemporary art in Turkey, as it is claimed in art historical texts. As a consequence, being the only authority on Turkish art, the Academy of Fine Arts, which was strictly following formal modernist values, starts losing power on the local art production in the late 70s. The fact reveals itself with aggressive critiques by a large group of writers, consisted mainly from academy professors, who published back then in the local art journals. As I see it, these pieces show a clear resistance against the new values in which the art started to function, and bring up the subject of a certain modern contemporary dichotomy almost every time. As a result, fresh art writers and critics arise in confrontation, who basically argue for the contemporary art, and in order to do that properly, they write about new works and shows regularly, documenting almost every event that happens. What I conclude from these pieces is that, on one hand, documenting becomes an important tool for the legitimization of the new art. On the other, a new body of art historical writing emerges gradually, often consisted of exhibition reviews, interviews, or short theoretical discussions. Rather long pieces appear as well that tell the case of Western contemporary art back then, probably to inform the readers. But these just about always end up making comparisons with the Turkish art. A prominent subject in these articles appeared to be the question of contemporaneity. I came to realize that while analyzing the character of the contemporary, these pieces define the contemporaneity as a new level of cultural order, which is supposed to be achieved by Turkish artists rather than a temporal notion. As was in the Republican era, definitions and appropriations become important once again here. However, this time, the tone of articles seems to me to be more confident, particularly the way in which they discuss the uniqueness of Turkish contemporary art. Almost simultaneous emergence of Turkish contemporary art sets the tone. However, in these discussions, writers do not seem to be reflecting much about, if any, derivative aspects of the new art, which apparently seems less important comparing to simultaneous success. So question stands on contemporaneity rather than originality. Not until the 2000s, a complete book on Turkish contemporary art appears. Apart from the extensive catalogs of larger contemporary art shows or monographs, the first book on contemporary Turkish art arrives in 2007, which is called User's Manual, consists of essays by 16 different writers, presenting various perspectives on the emergence, pioneers, or development of contemporary Turkish art. The prologue text dedicates the book to the two fathers of contemporary art in Turkey, Altan Gürman and Sarkis. Gürman was a professor at the Art Academy who came back to Turkey after having his education in Paris, introducing proto-conceptual art to Turkey. Dying very young, in the late 60s, For many writers and historians, Gürman seems to be the hero who generated conceptual art or origins of contemporary art in Turkey. Apart from the fact that both of the artists are male, I find myself wondering why a female artist, for instance, Füsun Onur, who is exactly the same age with Sarkis and who often considered to be one of the pioneers, cannot be one of the fathers. And this immediately reminds me that another male artist, Osman Hamdi Bey, still keeps coining as the father of modern Turkish art in many of the modern art historical narratives. Even though only 3 female artists are mentioned in modern Turkish art, the numbers multiply in due course towards the 50s. However, the question stands on the point of suggesting fathers for the very first book of contemporary Turkish art. One of the things that keep coming back in these texts is the effort to point the founders of the contemporary Turkish art. This also becomes a recurrent theme in other books or catalogs which deal with the same history. For instance, in User's Manual, Beral Madra refers to a new expressionist paintings of the group identified as 1968 generation of modernist tradition, right along with Füsun Onur and Altan Gürman. This act of conceiving reveals as Füsun Onur, Sarkis, and Altan Gürman in Erden Kosova's text from the same book, considering the catalog of a huge exhibition called Modern and Beyond from 2007, which attempts to tell the story of modern and contemporary Turkish art. I see that Fulya Erdemci takes merely the first collages by Altan Gürman in 1965 as the starting point. And Süreyya Evren from another book from 2007 not only takes Sarkis and Altan Gürman as founders, but marks specifically Altan Gürman's work Montage 4 and Sarkis' contribution to the groundbreaking exhibition of Harald Zeman when attitudes become form as key moments that start the period of the new art in Turkey. Another text, actually a conversation between Erden Kosova and Vasif Kortun, published online in 2007 on the website called Offside But Goal, communicates a different view on the narrative. They argue that the women artists essentially construct the backbone of contemporary Turkish art. Furthermore, they disclose that they were working on a pattern in which Füsun Onur and Sarkis appear as grandmother and grandfather, respectively, with 3 prominent women artists of the 80s, as you can see there, following them as mothers. Even though this arrangement doesn't refer to a father figure, and 2 parties in conversation explicitly say that they have grouped them in a context where the father doesn't exist, they implicitly refer to its inexistence as an existence. As this conception shows, the contemporary Turkish art historiography is often in need for man to show up, save the day, and create a new order. Though it could be considered better than a hero complex, it seems to be stuck in the image of an illusory family which intends to perceive the contemporary Turkish artistry in generations, whereas generations are supposed to succeed each other. A distinct approach also seems trying to find its way in the contemporary art history writing. For instance, Erden Kosova, in an essay published in 2007, talks about a certain constellation of artists from Istanbul and Diyarbakır who established a particular discursive interaction and continuum between them, worked ways in which straightforwardly reacting to the social tension of the 90s. While referring to the coexistence of artists, the constellation emerges as a term which is as much borrowed as reconstructed here in a new context. It attempts on the one hand to deal with gender issue without referring hero or father figures, but imagining a coexistence, and on the other to deal with the national identity problem in Turkey, producing a paradigm shift on the way in which Turkish Kurdish identity is perceived, and here embodied with the name of the cities Istanbul and Diyarbakır. Another paradigm shift comes from Süreyya Evren's essay, which I previously mentioned. Although this text needs to refer certain founding fathers in contemporary Turkish art, Evren's intention to structure the story in retrospect makes a difference, leaving aside the chronological or linear narrative. Evren imagines selected contemporary works of art in overlapping temporalities, which enables him to suggest the possibility in that a later work opened the path for an earlier work, or claim that an earlier work followed a later work. Leaving aside the question of whether that is possible in reality or not, Evren clearly challenges the progressive conception of historical narrative. The way in which he operates enables him to make connections between works by different artists from different times in context of various issues. As alternative history of Evren makes me reflect on the problematic of progressive narratives, I'd like to pay attention, lastly, to some of the art historical texts of that sort. Whilst positioning artists and works in a chronological sequence, progressive Turkish art histories keep on standing on the paradox of East and West. While being a recurrent theme in most of the histories, this paradox relies on the claim that Turkey, even though being a non-Western country, succeeded to catch up with the West just fine. Way in which they locate either modern or contemporary Turkish art, they at the same time feel constrained to face the fact of being a follower, which reveals itself with the discursive structure they form. In this kind of narratives, expressions such as the rupture of art production in Turkey from modernism into postmodernism in the 70s was starting to connect with the European art movements. Or synchronicity with the Western world in Turkey came to be in late 80s and more so in the 90s through the encounter of Turkish contemporary art with the West. Or as in the other modernism projects at the periphery of Western modernism, Turkish modern art is also Western-based, in particular European, and makes reference to that. A step forward takes me to another but similar perspective, which responds to a broader view of the West, coining expressions such as in the 1990s, curated exhibitions were realized, which served the important function of including the production of art in Turkey in the international art production. Or, these are the works that place Turkey in the world art map. Let alone setting expectations higher, these assumptions force Turkish art to respond to a wider but vague competition, such as world or international art, and keep the ghosts of the past coming back over and over again. Telling the history of contemporary or modern Western history of art in a Turkish art historical text doesn't help either, which seems to be a common tendency in many of the texts. Moreover, this mindset compels the reader to only think through that paradox and keeps the growing sense of falling behind in the competition with the Western, or better yet, with international contemporary art, which at the same time explains the reasons for writers for employing a progressive narrative. It enables them to prove that Turkish art developed in time and just on time, as it was expected of it. Thank you for listening.
So now Kemal Zavrak will give his talk. Kemal recently graduated from UC Santa Barbara with an MA in art history focusing on Iranian art, critical theory, and the analysis of art institutions. He has frequently published on photography and is currently working at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. as the Development Associate for Stewardship and Communications, and coordinates the production of the Bulletin. He's previously worked at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, having studied Italian art and history, which I think would provide a very interesting comparative angle. But right, today we're in the Iranian art world more specifically, and the talk is called Interior, Exterior, Institutional Critique in the Iranian Institution of Art.
Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. 1 second, please. I'm sorry. Yes,
From the beginning, right?
sure. All right.
And then just arrow keys.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the AMCO organizers for inviting me. Thank you to NYU Greta for organizing. So as mentioned, I work at a large art institution, but today I'm going to talk a little bit about the critique of art institutions. So my talk is titled Interior-Exterior Institutional Critique and the Iranian Institution of Art. This is this work is a continuation of research I began in graduate school, where I investigated the social and political implications of art exhibitions coordinated by the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which is up on the screen. And since graduate school, I've been interested in the broader institution of art, meaning both physical institutions as well as the ideological framing of art that is imposed by institutions, primarily museums. So this led me to the Western art movement of institutional critique. Now, I know the initial call for this conference was to question the limits of Western methods of analysis and critique. But in studying the work of Western institutional critique artists, I argue that there are valuable lessons to be learned when attempting to understand and critique the institutionalization of art in contemporary Iran. Has institutionalization actually occurred? Who are the enforcers? What are the exact parameters of the institution? And how does one combat the institution? These are all questions that artists in the West raised 40 years ago. And today, I think they're applicable in Iran. So the question I wanted to explore in this talk is, how can the study of institutional critique help to better understand and, if necessary, critique the current institution of art in Iran? And the answer begins by understanding the dialectic of interiority and exteriority vis-a-vis the institution of art and, more broadly, Iranian society as a whole. Now, for institutional critique artists, the interior versus exterior divide has been a dominant theme, as well as an important tool for their artistic practice. For Iranians, the notions of interiority and exteriority are ingrained in everyday life, particularly when we refer to private versus public space. And the modern roots of this can be found in the writings and lectures of Dr. Ali Shariati, an influential Iranian ideologue who was active during the 1960s and 1970s. Shariati's views on culture, religion, the West, and revolution comprised an influential ideology that paved the way for the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, and ultimately the Islamic Republic. So where the overlap is between institutional critique, the ideology of Shariati, and the Iranian institution is my main question, but what this overlap might say about the value and role of art in Iran, hopefully be the bigger takeaway. So before comparing several pieces and exhibitions of Iranian contemporary art, I want to provide a brief synopsis of institutional critique and Shariati's ideology as they relate to the interior-exterior dialectic. Institutional critique was a byproduct of the anti-establishment 1960s and 1970s in the West. Artists produced works that revealed and critiqued the powers that they believed responsible for the art institution's failure to provide the public with a non-ideological sphere that was open to critical debates. Simply put, their goal was to inspire the return of the modernist notion of art for art's sake, which in the 1960s and 1970s seemed to have been overrun in part by art for the institution's sake. So by breaking the barriers between public and private, poor and rich, high and low, interior and exterior, and most of all, thwarting authoritarianism from consuming the culture industry. These, through artworks that were critical of the art institution, these artists created a realm that's transcended into, quote, a critique of national policy. So how does the interior-exterior divide apply to institutional critique artistic methods? Some artists worked from the exterior, outside of the physical art institution, as well as outside of the dominant ideological frame. Other artists worked from the interior, at times in cooperation with the very same institutions they were critiquing. Now, for example, I'm going to talk about two of the main artists of the movement. American artist Andrea Fraser performed a piece called Museum Highlights, in which she posed as a museum docent at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Fraser herded a group of museum goers through galleries, coat rooms, and even bathrooms as she challenged the very definition of art in a Duchampian, even satirical manner. The interior-exterior divide can also be applied to the formal qualities of a piece. Here's an image of German artist Hans Hacke's conceptual heavy condensation cube, which engenders interesting questions, I think, about the rate or the effect of change inside a closed system from the outside. In this case, the condensation level inside the container is subject to the exterior space temperature, which changes per the number of people that occupy the exterior space. As one of the earliest artists involved in institutional critique, Hacke has been praised by Andrea Fraser as being, quote, the first to understand and represent the full extent of the interplay between what is inside and outside the field of art. Now, at the same time that Hans Hacke was laying the foundation for institutional critique, Ali Shariati was raising his own criticisms in Iran. Growing up in the Iranian holy city of Mashhad and having completed his PhD in sociology at the Sorbonne in Paris, Shariati had a dualistic East-West education. Now, despite being heavily influenced by Western thinkers, Shariati promoted interiority for Iranian society, a champion of native Iranian culture and of authentic Islamic religion. He also warned against exteriority, against Westoxification, worry of foreign capitalists who imposed modernity in the guise of civilization. Now, among the native and authentic Iranian elements, Shariati saw Islam as a primary antidote to the faithlessness, materialism, oppression, and alienation he believed had infected Iranian society. However, he also argued in his essay, Art Awaiting the Savior, that art, specifically modern art, like religion, could combat the ills of society. God endowed art to man, Shariati argued, in order to bring consciousness to his unconscious soul and to engender a deeper relationship with him. Now, in Shariati's anthology of critical writings and lectures, four principal elements helped comprise his ideology. And I argue that these are the same four principal elements that create the ideological frame of the current institution of art in Iran. The elements are present in both Iranian artists inside of the institution as well as those outside. But the interpretation and application of these different elements, the interpretation and application of the elements differs, thus altering the meaning and value of the art. So the four principal elements include Iran's Persian and Islamic cultural heritage, religion, primarily Islam, Iran's relationship with the West, and then finally, the concept of revolution, through which Shariati advocated martyrdom as, quote, a destination, an ideal, and the final stage of human evolution. And the frame of the contemporary Iranian institution of art has largely been administered by the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art under the auspices of the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance. Now, since the Iranian state's legitimacy was challenged in events that followed the 2009 presidential election, the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art has been a platform to reinstill values established by the 1979 revolution. As such, artworks selected for exhibitions often depict or celebrate Iran's Islamic and Persian cultural heritage, while Shariati-like language is employed in the manner in which exhibitions have been curated. For example, now this includes exhibitions in Iran as well as those outside, but they're all coordinated or curated by the staff at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. So the Islamic Republic's national exhibition at the 53rd Venice Biennale in 2009 exemplified how Islamic and Persian cultural heritage is being actively promoted. Iraj Eskandari directly appropriated Persian reliefs in his paintings. This piece was included in the exhibition, while Sadagat Jabari employed the technique of siyah mashq, a traditional calligraphic technique that was described in the exhibition as having roots in traditional Iranian Islamic art, and that was also free from explicit materialism. 2 years later, at the 54th Venice Biennale, the Islamic themes, coupled with themes of revolution and martyrdom, were more explicit. Included was an installation by Mortaza Dadabaghi, a poignant piece about death and martyrdom in the Iran-Iraq War. They had become one with light. Dadabaghi wrote about his work, an emotionally charged and reflective piece that was meant to impart, quote, the feeling that any visitor could be a martyr. Also included in the exhibition were photographs by Mohsen Rastani, which explore the dichotomy of native tradition and global modernity, of interior stories and myths versus exterior realities. Through such images, Rastani admits that reconciliation of the past and the contemporary world has historically presented a great challenge for Iran. 9 exhibitions housed at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art itself, Persian and Islamic themes are ever more dominant. In 2012, the museum's exhibition associated with the 4th Fajr International Festival of Visual Arts presented works by artists such as Habibullah Sadeghi. His painting, Such a Dance, was featured in the exhibition and is part of the museum's permanent collection. Large in scale and aesthetically pleasing, Such a Dance is a colorful contrast to Dadabaghi's more blunt black and white photo cutouts, yet it still speaks about the shadowy experience of death. Now, artworks and exhibitions at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art that fit inside the institutional framework are not limited to Iranian art. International art included in the museum's permanent collection and international exhibitions on loan are selected and curated for the institution's ideological frame. One recent example is an exhibition of Mexican contemporary prints, which included themes of tradition, revolution, and death. Stepping outside of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art and outside of the ideological frame it imposes, we find Iranian artists who occupy the exterior space. This includes the street artist sibling pair known as Aysin Sot, whose work often challenges social aspects of contemporary Iranian culture. Also, Iranian artists living inside of Iran who produce work about outside influence, primarily Western influence, also occupy the exterior space. Take, for example, the work of Shirin Ali Abadi, whose photographs demonstrate contemporary Western material and consumer influence on Iranian youth culture. And these artists, similar to their exterior institutional critique peers, employ the quality of, quote, the spectacle, understanding and appreciating its power, which has certainly been bolstered by new media in the recent past. My final example is a recent photography book that just came out titled Iranian Living Room. It's published by the Italian research center Fabrica. Now, this book explores the divided lives of Iranians. While popular media provides plenty of images of veiled Iranian women, bearded Iranian men, in the exterior spaces of Iranian society, this book takes us inside to explore the unique space, quote, the unique space beyond global media and local state. So by pulling the curtain on the interiority of Iranian lives, these photographs provide a rare glimpse into everyday Iranian life and also raise interesting questions about tradition clashing with modernity. Now, my analysis of the Iranian institution of art is contextualized to a post-2009 Iranian society. Previous to 2009, specifically from 1998 to 2005, there was a period in which art exhibitions were pluralistic, diverse, and most of all challenging to viewers. This is in large part due to the tenure of Dr. Alireza Sami-Azar as director of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. Sami-Azar helped create a very productive and positive period for the contemporary Iranian art institution, A multitude of artists were able to show their work in Iran and abroad, and prominent international art was brought to Iran, both with limited, or at the very least, an expanded ideological frame. Consequently, during this period, the line dividing the interior and exterior became blurred. There were still exhibitions that included artwork infused with Persian and Islamic themes, but also included was artwork that challenged social realities that are today at times taboo in Iranian society or even exempt from critique. Sami Azar's tenure at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art exemplified how the institution of art is not the problem within itself. In fact, several decades of the institutional critique movement in the West has demonstrated that over time, non- or anti-institutionalism will likely develop its own ideological frame, its own set of standardized beliefs that turn it into an institution. Andrea Fraser conceded to this point when she said that, quote, "It's not a question of being against the institution. We are the institution. It's a question of what kind of institution we are, what kind of values we institutionalize, and what forms of practice we reward, and what kinds of rewards we aspire to. These are the questions that institutional critique demands we ask above all of ourselves." End quote. Now, after visiting some of these exhibitions that I spoke about here, both in Italy and Iran, and appreciating the breadth of Iranian modern and contemporary art, several key points have been reaffirmed. First, the simple fact that the institutionalization of art has occurred in Iran as much as it has in the West. Second, shifts in the institutionalization of art have coincided with shifts in the Iranian political landscape. And third, in order to understand both the interior and exterior spaces of the Iranian art institution, the four principal elements of heritage, religion, the West, and revolution, I argue, are critically applicable. These elements still relate to issues that have yet to be fully reconciled in Iranian society, and until they are, they will continue to be frequent points of interest and debate for artists and critics. Now, in 2013, the various Iranian institutions have dragged the country into a current state of social, political, and economic difficulty. It may be the opportune time to once again blur the line dividing the interior and exterior of the Iranian institution of art, and to allow and promote art that is critical, and to limit ideological framing. And there was obviously a precedent for this during the tenure of Dr. Ali Reza Sami Azar. And even recent political shifts towards moderation in Iran, as well as re-engagement between Iran and the West, could lay the groundwork needed to foment a more liberal art institution. And if we're lucky and criticality returns to the institution as an acceptable artistic practice, as it was in the early 2000s, then, as posited by Alexander Albero, the value and role of art in contemporary Iran can be that it leads to a critique of national policy. Now, modern contemporary art have never been one-dimensional, and methods of critique should not be one-dimensional. But I argue that with the sound understanding of the notions of interiority and exteriority, and taking into consideration the common elements I mentioned, heritage, religion, the West, and revolution, those of us who are writers and critics of Iranian art can develop our own methods of critique that are specifically contextualized to the Iranian condition. Thank you.
Okay, now the last participant in the panel is Stacy Demshai-Willer. She is assistant professor of art history at California State University, Stanislaus. Having earned a PhD from UC Santa Barbara, she has published extensively on Qajar art and most recently edited a volume entitled Performing the Iranian State, Visual Culture and Representations of Iranian Identity. And her paper is Ottoman and Qajar Modernisms, a comparison that provincializes Europe.
Hopefully. Thank you. Thank you for everyone coming. Thank you to AMCA for inviting me. It's a pleasure and a joy to be here, especially with people working on similar topics. So it just helps us grow and learn about our own subfield of global modernisms. Last year, I was very delighted to read Wendy Shaw's Ottoman Painting, in which she discusses how even though modernist cultural production in the Ottoman Empire may have seemed derivative of European modernisms, it did not bear the same ideological baggage and intention of colonialism and Orientalism. Unfortunately, I read the book just after I had submitted an article on the rise of Iranian modernism. Nevertheless, I was intrigued as a scholar on Iran and not on the Ottoman Empire by how differently the Ottomans and Qajars understood modernity and then portrayed their notions of the modern moment in their artwork, even though both Ottoman and Qajar artists had studied in Europe and adopted several European techniques and media. A case in point is that several Ottoman artists, including Usman Hamdi Bey, painted in what has been perceived or described as an Orientalist style, but subverted this genre to speak of Ottoman nationalism and modern identity. Iranian artists, such as Kamal Amok and his students, hardly ever dabbled in Orientalism. Both Ottoman and Qajar artists were moved by photography and lithography and how these could be merged with modernist painting. But what they chose to depict through the aid of photography also varied greatly. Moreover, although European art played a role in developing a modernist aesthetic in the Middle East, after all, global modernisms includes European cultural production, as Europe is part of the globe. But instead of non-European cultural production behaving like satellites around the major cultural cities of Europe, one could also gain more insight on how this visual language developed by focusing more on the negotiations between variations of modernism in Islamicate regions. Other disciplines, such as history and political science, have already contributed sustainable discourses on modern exchanges between the Ottoman Empire and Qajar Iran, including works by Turaj Atabaki and Nader Sohrabhi. So it would seem that this relatively new subfield of global modernisms would benefit from expanding this approach. Initially, the field of global modernisms has been intent on legitimizing non-European modern artwork as worthy as its European counterparts. But I think one could move beyond that now, accepting that non-European modernism is valid and important to the discourses of modernism as a whole. What has become more useful to me, then, is how the modern self has been constructed in the Ottoman Empire and Qajar Iran, how that sense of the modern surfaced in their artwork, and how their own art histories developed a course of representation. The Ottoman and Iranian empires have had a long, strange relationship with each other that is complicated and difficult to nuance. Despite their arguing manuscripts and narratives, the Turanians being the losers in the Shahnameh, a manuscript that the Iranian ambassador in this image, brings as a gift to the Ottoman court. Yet the Young Turks Revolution of 1908 and the Constitutional Revolution in Iran from 1906 to 1911 took place around the same time. And when the Sunni Caliphate was in dissolution by 1924, the Shia ulama in Iran expressed concern that the collapse of the Caliphate meant the collapse of the Ummah and that Islam would be in crisis. Later, Reza Shah Pahlavi would look to Ataturk's models of reform and even visit him. Yet the secularization of their states took vastly different turns. Some have argued that Reza Shah could not fully emulate his Turkish counterpart due to the cultural and religious differences between Iran and Turkey. So in looking at their histories of painting, their trajectories in general also went into different directions, which may be one of the reasons why their modernist expressions in painting also varied. Indeed, Iranian artists played an important, crucial role initially in Ottoman painting, as well as Italian artists. But the general desires and goals of representation in both Ottoman and Iranian painting during the early modern era were fundamentally different. Whereas This is just a generalization for this talk. Whereas early modern Iranian painting was more metaphorical or idealistic based on literature, early modern Ottoman painting depicted more actual events, monuments, and specific persons that one could even identify. The dominance of Persian culture and language in the three early modern empires of Safavid Iran, Mughal India, and the Ottoman Empire were countered in the late 16th century when Ottoman artists and poets sought a more authentic expression that relied less on the Persian language, narratives, and literature. And this included painted representations that differed from those of the earlier Iranian artists who had worked at the Ottoman court. These Safavid and Ottoman encounters are important to consider as they comprise the early modern moment, which became pivotal as the foundation that would lead to modernity, a date whose own origins is contested. From a Eurocentric point of view, which is also contested, many have argued that the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789 signifies that watershed moment. Shana Huffaker has argued that it was in 1798 for the modern Middle East when Napoleon's forces invaded Egypt and Syria. Yet it was in 1779 when Mohammed Khan Qajar sought to unify Iran and in 1795 accomplished that feat, claiming himself Shah of all of Iran. The construction of the modern self then varies from country to country and region to region, as well as what defines that moment of contact and change. I also think that perhaps the way late Ottoman and Qajar art has been framed by Islamic art surveys contribute to this disconnect. For instance, many art Islamic surveys end before the 19th century, or if Qajar or late Ottoman art is included, it is denounced as a decline, and this decline has been attributed to European influences, thus turning this cultural production into something that cannot be related to past empires and thus cut off. In light of these early modern histories of painting in Iran and the Ottoman Empire, Leyla Diba has also noted that the two forerunners of Turkish and Iranian modernisms, Usman Hamdi and Kemal Amok respectively, followed similar pathways to developing a modernist rhetoric in their own countries, but parted the ways in representation. For example, both of them studied in Paris and were drawn to more conservative academic modes of painting. Kemal Amok was close friends with Henri Fantin-Latour and preferred academic naturalism over the avant-garde movements of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Likewise, Usman Hamdi studied with Gustave Boulanger and possibly Jean-Léon Gérôme, who were both established academic painters, Orientalists, and the antithesis of European avant-gardes. It is also quite possible that while in Paris, Usman Hamdi met Mirza Ali Akbar, one of Kemal Amok's teachers. So when one returns to the argument same but different, this relates not only to global modernisms in Islamicate countries in respect to European cultural production, but also in relation to each other. And one could break this down further, that there were competing modernisms within the Ottoman Empire and Qajar Iran themselves, such as the Gafeh Khane paintings being in stark contrast to the naturalism of Kemal Amok. Yet Kemal Amok saw his own paintings as avant-garde, hoping that they would promote a revolutionary consciousness. Kemal Amok himself became a staunch supporter of the constitutional revolution, and Mohammed Hassan Semsar has argued that Kemal Amok's School of Fine Arts was the fruit of that revolution, only to be legitimized and co-opted by the Iranian state, eventually ending in Kemal Amok's resignation in 1928. Meanwhile, Hadi Saif has noted that during the constitutional revolution, the painting of the Gaveh Khane, which is on the screen, experienced a vigorous revival, and that painters of the coffee house were thought to be the only ones in touch with the hardships and national values of the common people. Therefore, both styles promoting a revolutionary consciousness. In the case of the Ottomans and the Qajars, a construction of the modern self and moment depended on several factors, although both parties were subjected to what I call a panoptic modernity. continually under the European gaze and having to prove themselves to European powers that they too were part of this modern dialogue. Ahmed Ersoy has argued that the Tanzimat reforms had played a more than significant role, not only in modernizing the Ottoman Empire, but also in creating a quote-unquote an acute awareness of being expelled from the past, end quote, thus lending to several Ottoman painters to invoke a type of Orientalist representation as a tool to reimagine and reclaim Ottoman history and identity. In 1839, the Ottoman Empire began its Tanzimat reforms, which were a series of modernizations to compete with imperial powers, including, but not limited to, the first banknotes, paper banknotes, the reorganization of the army, reorganization of the finance system and the civil and criminal codes, adoption of a national anthem and flag, establishment of a majlis, and the construction of railroads. These reforms filtered to Iran via diplomats and exiles. Istanbul became a city of possibilities for those who criticized the Qajar monarchy and sought reform. A bastion of exile literature, instrumental in spurring the constitutional revolution, blossomed in the Ottoman Empire, such as Akhtar, which ran from 1875 to 1905. In addition to the cultural exchange, the border disputes between the Ottoman Empire and Iran made the Ottomans a competitive power to the Qajar monarchy, such as the case of the Ottoman-Persian War of 1821-23, whose treaty had to be renewed in 1847 in light of continued border incidents. From reading Qajari texts, however, I would be hesitant to claim that the Iranians during the 19th century felt expelled from history in the way that Ersoy argues for the Ottomans. Despite efforts of the Qajar dynasty to modernize Iran, which also included, but was not limited to, standardizing money, reorganizing the army, creating a postal system, and paving roads, the legacy of the Qajar dynasty, both then and now, was that they did not do enough to modernize. Iranian intellectuals from the period, including Kermani, Al-Afghani, Akhundzadeh, and Abdul Baha, the last three all having connections to the Ottoman Empire, have argued consistently that modernity was being robbed from them in various ways. Intellectuals of this period suggested that Iran already had the potential to be modern, but somehow their modernity was arrested, be it by foreigners, a despotic government, Islam, or Arabs. It was more that they were expelled from the present rather than being expelled from the past. And briefly considering one construction of the modern self, in this case vis-a-vis modernizing reforms and relating them both to Ottoman and Qajar modernist expressions, a striking difference is the Ottoman appropriation of the European genre, Orientalism. Whereas I've hardly ever seen it adopted by Qajar artists. This is the only one that comes to mind from Kamal Amok and his students. There might be more, but I haven't seen them. And this is also an observation that Layla Diba has made. I do appreciate, however, Mary Roberts reframing Usman Hamdi's paintings, calling them historical genre paintings, based on her interpretations of the writings by Ottoman art critic Abdullah Kamal, who praised Usman Hamdi's artwork as that of a quote-unquote true patriot. Indeed, his works may look Orientalist to a Eurocentric perspective, but how else would Usman Hamdi then depict the nostalgic past using the academic aesthetic he had been trained in? What was considered an Orientalist fantasy could be altered to convey a nostalgic or historical representation of an Ottoman past depicted by an Ottoman subject and hence did not duplicate the ideologies of European Orientalist paintings, although Usman Hamdi's color scheme and naturalistic rendering look similar in a Eurocentric reading. Let me go back. In relation to Qajar artists, there are several possible reasons why they may have not used a similar modality of historical genre painting that some Ottoman artists invoked as modernist expressions. Although writers and intellectuals of Qajar Iran understood through a panoptic modernity that they were seen as backward and Eastern in European discourses, the Orientalist paintings were other for them as well, because the motifs depicted were often North African or Turkish Arab from the Ottoman Empire. To subvert Orientalism, as several Ottoman artists did, which again, I'm questioning the framing of that as if it's fair or not. That's why I prefer the historical genre painting. But if so, it was a representation of a system of representation that Iranian artists could not relate to in order to speak of a nationalist or modernist sentiment. And considering the anti-Arab sentiment circulating in Qajar, Iran, espoused by intellectuals such as Akhundzadeh and Kermani, the Arab other was anything but Iranian and modern. In fact, Arabs and Islam were seen as reasons that Iran could not compete effectively. Thus, the romanticization of North Africa, the Holy Land, or other parts of the Ottoman Empire, which were prominent motifs in Orientalism, probably could not elicit Iranian interest in the ways that Ottoman painters could appropriate. That is not to say that Usman Hamdi, with his own diverse heritage, did not view Arabs as other, as Ersoy has pointed out. Hamdi may have used the image of the Arab, such as in his El Bizier Usmaniye, as a source of both, quote, authenticity and difference, the image of a distant and exotic past, since these regions were assumed to have remained untarnished. Usman Hamdi used Arab dress to dream up an idyllic Ottoman foresight, end quote. Yet Usman Hamdi's othering of the Arab was certainly counter to the historical othering of Arabs in the Iranian context, which framed them as anything but untarnished or idyllic. Usman Hamdi's Mihrab painting of 1901 is a much nuanced allegorical painting that engages many of the issues that society en masse in the late Ottoman Empire was processing. This image, though, which depicts Usman Hamdi's wife, as well as other naturalist depictions and portraits of women, point out the problematic issue of the female body in Qajar painting, a topic that right now I am wrestling with in my own monograph research. In terms of prototypes or literary figures, the female body in, go forward, the female body, the female body in painting is not the issue. It is the known female body, the identifiable body in Qajar painting, who dispels the fantasy and creates the moral dilemma by looking her, a topos written about in the poem Tasvir-e Zan by Iraj Mirza, in which the ulama were not upset that there was a public image of a woman, but that she did not have the proper hijab in being depicted as such. So what is interesting to note, however, is that both Wendy Shaw and Stephen Vernois have commented that the induction of the figural form in Ottoman mass visual culture was problematic, with Vernois citing deadly riots against public portraits of Mahmud II. Perhaps since the Ottoman Caliphate was the steward of Islamic holy sites and the ultimate example of the Sunnah that it had to negotiate with a particular hadith than the Shia Qajar society did, I have not come across any type of angst toward the figure in the writings of Kamal al-Mulk, Nasr al-Din Shah, or Etemad al-Sultani. And yet, when it comes to naturalism and depicting a less than covered decent man or woman, like these types of images would not have shown up from Kamal al-Mulk's students, from his own work, there seems to be some trepidation on the part of the Qajar artists, although there was no issue in depicting actual women in Qajar photography, from a whole nother ball of wax. And then some of Kamal al-Mulk's students relied more on younger people, children, teenagers, to depict that naturalistic form. Finally, I close with Ottoman and Qajar modernist expression between photography and painting. At the Qajar court where Kamal al-Mulk was head painter, photography and even cinema had become major art forms, and he himself had acknowledged using photographies in devising his paintings. Likewise, Ottoman painters employed photographs to assist them in creating paintings. However, Vernois suggests that photography was more easily accepted in Iran than the Ottoman Empire, and what was to be photographed and then later depicted also varied. For example, in the Iranian context, everything possible was photographed and used for depiction by major artists, even the backward, quote unquote, or superstitious, as artists seemed intent on illustrating the everyday. maybe not so much the nostalgic past, but perhaps of being expelled from that present. Although a romantic nostalgia for the past could be produced by historical genre painting, Abdul Hamid II was very particular about what was to be photographed and disseminated, distributing his albums to international expositions that displayed how modernized and educated the Ottoman Empire was in face of Europe's panoptic policies toward the Middle East. Although the Armenian-Iranian photographer Kevorkian, who also worked for the Nasiri court, photographed many aspects of Iran for foreign consumption, even Iranian women going to the bathroom, Nasser al-Din Shah's photographic albums were not displayed internationally and were not meant to be seen outside a very small group of select persons. Moreover, what I hope to show through this very short presentation is that what remains to be seen in depth is how global modernisms took divergent paths despite being in close proximity to or in dialogue with each other. If non-European modernisms had been simply mimetic, it would all look the same or be similar. But in the case of the Ottoman Empire and Qajar Iran, their artists began pathways of representing modernity that illuminate not just their engagement with Europe, but also their own historical engagement with the past and with each other. Although there had been overlap in their painted expressions during the early modern period, Iranian and Ottoman painting styles had diverged by the end of the 16th century. Although not formulaic, it would make sense that their modernist expressions would also follow slightly different modalities. Hence, same and difference applies not only to modern art in the Middle East and Europe, but also modern art in the Middle East, period. As we are all discursive ideological subjects, our interests, our intellectual formations, and our ways of seeing do not emerge out of a vacuum. In this regard, we are not writing outside of art history, and likewise, the Ottoman and Qajar artists did not study in Europe and then dramatically change the sign system, but participated, developed, and expanded or rebelled against discourses that were already in place. Thank you. Sorry. Should we go up?
Sure, it would be great, but
Okay.
you don't have to. It's not like it's a firing squad. So now I have the task of discussing these papers, and I want to thank AMCA for giving me the opportunity to do this. It is definitely a learning opportunity. I've learned about Iranian, Ottoman, Qajari, Maghrebi art. It's pretty much all new to me, but that's also the reason it is a ginormous challenge. So the first way I want to come at it is to talk about some themes that I found in all the papers. One was the concern to contribute to the project among artists, curators, and organizers today to reconcile the past and the present. And by the former, they mean something transcending space, sometimes called contemporaneity. And by the latter, they mean the past of art production in a country, and also the past of a country in art production. Therefore, the issue of establishing a modern nation as opposed to one that makes neither art nor art history comes to the fore in their work, and the impulse is generally here, as in the field at large, to bridge the alleged gap. Now, they do this by approaching history as a kind of construction of form and content, which I think is appropriate for art historiography. And this promise is especially apparent in the comparative methodology of the papers by Stacy and by Fanny and Annabelle. Kamal conducts an institutional history focusing on a discourse that requires thinking spatially, interior and exterior. He unpacks the contents of either side of the divide and finds more similarity than predicted. The same four compass points that structure institutional art discourse structure non-institutional art discourse, but perhaps here the compass needle points upside down, as it were. Ceren also prioritizes a discursive analysis. She deconstructs Turkish art historical writing to find something like a Hegelian understanding of art that seeks to evaluate it in terms of a progressive evolution as a manifestation of a national spirit in the histories she's looking at. And she connects this to the production of structuring categories, gender, the canon, and so on. This enables her to talk about the impact of increasingly regular art writing and the debates that congeal and harden, such as that about the founders.
Stacy, redirects current dissatisfaction with art history from an obsession with Eurocentric exclusivism to kind of ontological mutuality, not setting up a counter-institution of art history, but exploring what she calls the course of representation, or possible unfolding of a concept, here modernity, in a specific ideological context. Her comparative method enables a structuralist detaching of form content, or what she calls ideological baggage, but she goes beyond what could have been a reenactment of the bifurcation, thank you, that is the core of diffusionist questions of origin and influence, to look at interactions and entanglements in modernizing forms. Annabelle and Fanny come at the problem from a different angle, that of art writing through the decades and the relationship between a professionalized art world with an art market, and the possibility of writing about art as if it's a self-perpetuating institution. Now, feminist art historians have dissected the act of filiation in the production of canonical artists. And by contrast, Annabelle and Fanny show that the act of filiation requires being taken up and constructed in literary strategies that construct a past and a present together. In other words, they question the necessity of history rather than assuming that art has a history. Another theme that I think is extremely important is competition, in this kind of south-south that Stacy does, but also between and within the art worlds that we've learned about here. It helps us move beyond a Eurocentric bias that requires assuming the unified status of the non-Western art world or the outside. And thirdly, there is a shared concern to answer the question, what is the value of art today? It strikes me as an odd question that does not directly relate to the issue occupying the panel. And the fact that it arises points to the assumption that to take Kamal's paper, quote, the value of art in contemporary Iran can be that it leads to the critique of national policy. And I gather this tendency has to do with the desire to criticize art history itself as an institution and blur that interior-exterior gap, making it more relevant, or rather revealing its potential relevance and current irrelevance, perhaps. My fear is that, if we pay attention to curators and journalists, right? But my fear is that we repeat the move of perhaps that early institutional art critique that you discussed, Kamal, which glorified the original promise of universal art, a promise that was no less invested in ranking and controlling than the institutions that involved from it. Now, I have questions to the separate panelists. For Annabelle, the Francophone art writing that dominated what you were studying, I wonder if you could then, especially drawing on your comparative work with Thailand, look at kind of Indochine correspondences in Francophone art writing and how people took that up. There's also Nora Taylor's work on Vietnamese art. And, okay, as you said, you question the necessity of history, but you do this chronologically, and I think maybe you could delve more into writing strategies that bring other concepts into conversation with the necessity of history. One example is when Michet Krifa, right? Yeah, starts a catalog by saying, creators and citizens, actors and witnesses, since its first glimmering, artists have accompanied events in their unrolling history on the march. Now, what roles are being delegated as a motor to history here? You could use the comparative study to show more than how history was being invested by actors. How did this conceptual activism create actors worthy of history as a background to creative, sovereign present? For Stacy, you said as your task to tell us how Ottomans and Qajars differently understood modernity and then portrayed their notions of the modern woman. Now, this structuring of your sentence implicitly suggests that the understanding precedes the portrayal. I wondered why you put it that way. This would seem to be at odds with your insistence that modernity was not a thing per se, sui generis, but it came into being in the process of being taken up in different ideological contexts by people aware of, but not submissive to each other. So how was art as a realm and set of practices key to working out these ideas? Among them, modernity. And so, i.e., it was neither derivative of someone else's ideas nor illustrative of one's own ideas. Along those lines, a question about terminology, I was just wondering, what's the term for being professionalized that gets used there?
And I really like the term panoptic modernity. I wondered how you might relate that to Jonathan Crary's techniques of an observer, where the subject is the interaction with art, with the subject person, right? For Kamal, you mentioned a dualistic East-West education and dualistic arguments about Iran. I wondered if you could explain that further, what you meant by the dualistic East-West education. And in your conclusion, you suggest that 2013 is the time to allow art to be critical. Isn't art that is interior critical too, just of something else? What could be shown by contrasting institutional critique in art, institutional critique that is in art with other realms of institutional critique? What new interiority, exteriority conceit is being organized with institutional critical art today? Could you give examples of art production, such as works and exhibitions, that would blur interiority, exteriority? That Iranian photo album could be taken that way, opening up the interior and showing there's much more globalism inside, much less difference. But it also, of course, inscribes a division between free and repressed spaces, at least for viewers who don't have kind of a residential knowledge. For Sharon, I'm very intrigued by the decision to take on the state's deliberate decision to import a model from the West. And right? And I'd note that your paper imitates that decision, bringing Hobsbawm into your analysis in a very self-reflexive, appropriating kind of move. You thereby turn the conventional discussion of influence, as if it's passive and unconscious, into something much more active. In terms of a plastic version, I was really intrigued by this picture that I hadn't seen before, Beethoven in the Harem. And I didn't catch the painter's name, Abdul Majid, somebody, right? Is it contextualizing Beethoven or imagining a different context for the harem? Is the harem an icon there that the artist has invented? They don't necessarily have to be either or. And my next question comes from thinking about your paper in relation to Stacy's concern for mutuality. When you introduce your topic, you say, this quote, "The story starts with the Ottoman Empire, which gradually integrated into global modernity in the 19th century," which doesn't fit what you were saying before, how they imported this thing as a model. What was global modernity then? Is there something that globally existed prior to the Ottoman Empire's interaction with it? It seems a very important issue to clarify because of the impulse found in art historiography that you talk about to mimic the integration, but then what's happening in that mimesis kind of move? Who has made, in other words, art history universal? I also wondered more about agency in the subjects, who did what, why. You say, for example, the need for a formal Turkish national history of art arises for whom? Who felt the need? Need is such a visceral term relating to bodies getting on with living, and so what bodies were being presupposed here? In David Carrier's study of art writing, he suggests that it teaches people to see and evaluate themselves too, which would be very important for viewers and non-viewers alike who are reading about these exhibitions, for example. So I wondered how this art historiography that would have Ottoman calligraphy look like surrealist art be a claim on the Turks that are imagined as reading it. And then finally, it's just humorous that the illusory family that gets a grandmother and grandfather there contrast with the filiation that Annabelle and Fanny talk about. But there's this tension of building a separate kin structure, too. It's also about putting Turkey on the map. So a different kind of spatial move to put Turkey on the map. And I just wondered, in your reviewing the text, very closely reading them as you did, what other models of explanation did you see sort of slipping away as people were writing? And now questions to all the panelists. The visual artistic production of history, something that I wondered about. Stacy, building on your research and that of Wendy Shaw, you follow the form through other trajectories than that which would seem to be, I need water. So obviously inscribed, and of course one of the most interesting examples is the Orientalist or the academic realist. All right, but then there's a kind of a, what I want to call a relapse in your representational analysis, whereby modernity or some other universalizing concept is, as I said, understood and then portrayed. And so when we assume that pictures mean something or artworks mean something pre-extant that we can know, we assume that our duty, or well, first we assume that art's value or power lies only in its ability to act as an illustration
and that it's an inherently obedient form. And then we assume that our job is to go about hunting down a reference. It troubles me in my work. And so I was hoping that you all might speak to that. And I'm wondering, does art ever get out of hand? You can see how it sometimes circulates and develops reputations that artists are constantly trying to control, but other ways that art gets out of hand. And how do people learn from art? How do people, i.e. viewers, funders, and artists themselves, become convinced that something represents something, an artwork represents something else? If art historians are challenging exclusivism, is that the same as challenging its biases? And I think there are very interesting answers here about that. Does it mean proving one's conformity to the biases, a sort of panoptic, I'm talking about art historians now, a panoptic scholarism to build on your formula of panoptic modernism? The papers seem best to fulfill the panel's aspiration when they apply a practice-based model. Maybe I'm just an anthropologist, like down to the core, but who did what with what ideas and forms, rather than a concept of universal art unfurling in a place or not. And so in recognition of Kamal's essay, I think we can start to analyze the very term outside that is structuring the title of the panel. So I'm glad you were able to bring that spatial term in. And finally, I want to say, let's be art historians in the many senses of this double noun phrase. Let's study history in art and study the possibilities of historical concepts, the possibility, for example, of time or representation. We may say of a photo album that, quote, it raises interesting questions about tradition clashing with modernity. This is the Iranian photo album, right? Family. But what are these terms visually? What is special about visual, traditional, sensual existence or an ontology that's created in that way? If you can't take these artworks as representations, you can ask what the form and its genealogy produce in terms of ideas that people are trying to figure out, right? And when you, Stacey, look at a much older photograph album, but I think you said something now that messes up my idea. I was thinking about Nasser ad-Din Shah's and how you said the ruler sought to capture images to create an artificial essence of nationhood and culture. I was wondering, was he capturing or producing the images? Some of them were clearly staged too, right? Or no, that was the Ottoman one, sorry. But was he capturing or producing? Is he enacting a kind of transformation where he's abstracting elements that would enable a comparative approach to nationhood, as if it's kind of a mathematical formula, whereby the specifics of face-to-face life become variations on basic factors whose interaction can be formulated to produce something that has universal expression? Now, you said in your talk, and not in a paper, that he really didn't intend to circulate that at all. So some of the question goes away, although he is Nasser ad-Din Shah. So, and those are my remarks, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak about them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the panelists and for Kirsten for bringing these remarks. And I wonder if the panelists want to engage with any of these remarks before we open the floor to questions. We can borrow, technically, say 10 minutes? Yes, from the lunch. So. Someone?
I'll begin.
Okay.
There were several good questions in there, and I'll try to answer a few of them. In relation to the East-West that you mentioned, that I mentioned about Iran, and specifically that I mentioned about Shayati. First of all, his education. He was educated in Paris, that's where his PhD, but he's from a very holy city, Mashhad, and his ideas were continued from what people like Jalal Ahmad and Ahmad Fadid were saying before him. And then the Western side comes people from like Heidegger. So he kind of took these different notions, molded them, and there were certainly elements of contradiction, just kind of reading his, and diversity of work, writings and lectures that he wrote and spoke. but he molded something that I think was eventually led to some sort of revolutionary ideology that sort of paved the way for the revolution. And now today, the East-West divide, I think, as much as the native culture and heritage is very important, things like technology, the last 10 years have blurred that line because population there can much more easily access exterior culture, and they absorb that, and then they blur that line. Now, when it comes to exhibitions that do blur this line, I look to the early 2000s. I only put up 4 catalogs there, and during that time, I think there was a window of opportunity to expand the frame of the institution. And the director that I mentioned of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, Sami Azad, he certainly took advantage of that. He brought more criticality to the exhibitions. And what and this is a rough quote, that he said, he turned artists more into a power, and they realized their power. But when there was a shift towards more conservatism in 2005, that window of opportunity kind of became much more closed, and that sort of has continued since, I think. So that's, I think, a few.
Sometimes the agenda of a paper or thesis doesn't always come out clearly, but I think what I was trying to point out is that late Ottoman and Qajar modernist expression, they look different, and and I'm trying to figure out some of the reasons why, culturally, religiously, geographically, whatever it may be, why in some ways they took similar pathways, such as studying Paris, studying academic art, and yet what they brought home was completely different. And so instead of trying to locate it so much in that one moment, let's look at, they've had a history of taking divergent paths to each other. So it's not necessarily to say that there's something a priori that they're just automatically going to do something different. But if you start looking at how modernity itself was accepted or understood or adapted in different regions of the world, that can nuance of why perhaps the cultural production looks different or why they took different approaches. I don't know if that explains your question. I mean, modernity is not a thing, but it's a set of conditions that people are ingesting, reacting to, accepting, and the way those sets of conditions are employed or impacted or even set up in a particular country vary. So, for example, Iran didn't have railroads. There was too much contestation between the British and the Russians. So they didn't have railroads, but the Ottoman Empire did, for example. So what could be implemented was even different in these two different countries, even though they obviously had a connection. They were obviously in dialogue. They were obviously intellectuals. They were diplomats. So it wasn't like there was no dialogue, but yet there seemed to be, in the reflections of their art, a way to frame that modern moment that spoke to their own specificity, that was not necessarily mimetic, but trying to work out what was going on, in a regional context, in a global context, and in a local context. And I had also brought in the Kevorkian as opposed to Kamalamo. Both of them saw themselves as like this avant-garde, like this is the art of the people, and this is going to bring a revolutionary consciousness. So it's clear that on the ground, the concept of democracy, revolution, modernity was interpreted by local artists differently as well. So I don't know if that, no? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I started my research out of curiosity to see whether our texts, contemporary art historical, Turkish art historical texts, carry a different approach to the general narrative of art history. And I didn't think at first to find something different from the general European or American art histories or narratives, but gradually I started to realize that some different points or arguments can emerge from these narratives, and I started to look onto them more, like this argument on the generations or constellations. Which show up often in the texts, art historical texts, the generations, and the constellations less and less. And some other issues like the contemporaneity, which also could be emerge in other narratives such as Central European or Eastern European art historical texts, but they have a different point of view in Turkey about that issue. So I think I thought that I can take that as a rupture or a fraction in the art historical narrative of Turkey, which can work as a paradigm shift and a place to work with. So I think that's it.
Maybe the first part of the work about the chronology was something very important to do at first, but of course we have to use other concepts as well. Maybe because it's all the panelists that your presentation make me thinking like this, because finally when I start myself the field work in Tunisia before going to Thailand, the main problem was to face those concepts as modernity and identity. And finally, when you are in the field work, those concepts don't mean anything. And why in Tunisia it doesn't mean anything, like modernity, I start to understand now with this work that finally the writers, artists and historians don't really make reference to the modernity during those. The notion of modernity is not in the text, in the writing. We are more in front of the need of making the national state and not making Tunisian modernity. So we are more in front of dealing with the relation of the colony of France, and to create a new state, to which one artists have a part to do. And that the other thing that this work makes me understand is that this fixed history that we was facing when we start to work at the beginning of the years 2000 was very problematic to. So we have to, how to say. Usually we were in front of a narrative that was making the distinction between the colonization and after the independencies. But by doing this chronology of the history, we can understand that finally the slip is not with the independence, but 10 years after. So the real Tunisian art is more coming 10 years after the independency. So this show us maybe that the chronology that we usually use is not much that the good one. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? We have like 4 minutes. Okay, Celine.
I just have a question for Kamal.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the history of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art.
The history of it?
Yes, because my understanding is that it grows out of the Shah's collection of modern art. The Shah was a major collector of modern art in the 50s and 60s. And I just wondering how that kind of maybe sets the scene for what happens in the 90s.
Right. Yeah, I didn't mention really anything about the history, or it has quite a fantastic Western modern art collection, and that was started under the Shah, primarily by his wife and her cousin Kamran Diba, who was the architect of the building, helped establish the collection. The monarchy kind of underwrote the funding for it. But it was part of the Pahlavi push towards modernization and westernization, that sort of political aim. So once it was only open for about 2 years. So the idea, I believe, started in '68. It wasn't open until about '77. So then it was only open for about 2 years, and the revolution happened and kind of went underground for a while. But exhibitions started to come back after the war period in the early 90s. But things really took off in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, bringing back the Western collection out of the storages. And the collection, the Western collection, it's sort of a survey of modern Western art. I think about 400 pieces, kind of anybody from, I don't know, Monet up until Silhouette. But the story of it, and I was actually talking to someone yesterday about this, hasn't fully been told. I mean, people talk about it in various books and publications, but especially the founding of it. I know there's people out there that know about it more than I do. Some of the sources of who was really fully involved in building the collection, I have not been able to get, but it was certainly under sort of the purview of the monarchy.
But in 1977 or 79, was the art was modern art tainted, and was it marked, and did the mark index the West, or did it index the Shah and his regime such that for the next decade that art, or they were kind of artifacts of the Shah's oppression? Right.
Sure, you can look at it that way, but I think they understudied the value of it, and the monetary value of it is very high. So it's yes, you can say it is a symbol or mark of the Shah and whatnot. And from what I understand, only one painting was destroyed. It was a Warhol portrait, but I don't think they were going to destroy it because they knew the value of it and the importance of it. Even though it might have been a symbol of that era, that regime. But they didn't react quickly in 79, 80 to out of the emotion that was going on during that period.
Okay, thank you. Kaylin, you have?
I was struck in Sharon's talk about the split between the defenders of modernism as being academics and teachers and university professors, writing in what I assume was on a mainstream venue, newspaper.
Yeah, yeah.
that were where the sort of the vocation of the professionalized critic and curator was created by capitalism, by neoliberal policies, by the economy being up in Turkey. And I thought, because the quotes that you used were really very precise and very serviceable for the argument, but I wonder if in talking about arts writing and art history happening outside of art history in this panel, if more, there just needs to be like a little bit more attention paid to the politics and the economics of the venues in which that criticism is appearing. And if it's interesting also now, because I know that like Cassette does not write for newspapers, does not write about art for newspapers, and so how the use of criticism in these questions needs to be addressed as an art historical methodology of using criticism to make arguments when the venues in which criticism appears is changing so much. And if, just as a broader question, if Amka would ever address this topic in collaboration with another academic department, such as journalism.
Well, you can answer first.
Okay. The quotations I took, they are basically from the catalogs or the books. And these arguments that I mentioned from the 70s, they are all of them from the magazines and art journals. And they, well, I can say that they were mainstream, but they were the only journals that were being published in that time. And in my analysis, I only look at the art historical texts, not to criticisms, any kind of criticism, show or whatever artwork. But I only look at the texts that claim to create an art history for Turkey. So they are basically not criticisms, as I see it. But I see your point. Yeah. Is it okay? Who funded? Well, I don't know. Which one do you ask exactly? Is there something?
I mean, you had one with an image of a bunch of magazine covers, and I'm just wondering if those magazines were new?
No, they were from the 70s.
But were they new in the 70s? Like, were they?
Yes, they were new. Yeah, they were new. They started to be published in the early 70s, like 72, 73. If I don't remember wrong, one of them started to be published by an independent art lover, art collector. Another one, again, started to be published by an independent person, publisher, but then it was bought by a big publishing company, by a newspaper, but later. And the other one, again, another independent, started by an academic from Ankara. And the other one, which one I'm talking about now? It's so complicated without the names and everything, but, and the fourth one that I put the picture there was started again by a big publishing company, which is still publishing art books and things. Well, so it was.
Thank you. I think your question is really a very good question and requires a lot more discussion. Tomorrow, for the closing remarks, we have an hour where we can, in fact, address various questions like this one. But now I'm pressed for time and to send everyone to go have lunch so we can, be on time for the next session. So thank you very much for being here, and I see you everyone back at 2:30. Yes, thank you.